Hello and welcome back. So this video is actually a response to a question that I saw on Reddit, which is what are the advantages of a rooftop tent over a traditional pole pitch ground tent? And I'd actually like to take maybe a bit of a different approach to this video because I'm going to start with the disadvantages to rooftop tents. There are many, and let's just jump right into it. The number one is cost. Rooftop tents are incredibly expensive. This 4 seasons model, which is essentially the same as a 3 seasons, but it has this covered porch sort of area, which allows you to access and egress the tent in inclement weather. So if it's raining and snowing, when you unzip what would be the front door, that would be on an angle and you don't have water or snow entering directly into the tent that would soak onto your sheets. If you are fair weather campers, you can kind of get away with 3 season tents, but weather can be unpredictable. And if you've already committed to a trip and that happens to, include a day of rain, I simply just encourage everybody, if you're looking at a rooftop tent, to just go for 4 seasons. I think the benefits outweigh the costs, which is the literal costs. They are more expensive. So many big brands, like a Tepui, for example, I'll put the actual price down below, but I want to say it's anywhere between 3,700 and like 4,500 Canadian for what is a 2-person, and then it would go up from there for 3 and 4-person variants. So they're incredibly expensive, and the rooftop tent itself is just the starting. You still need to get a roof rack or a rack system by which to mount the actual tent. Now, some vehicles do have factory roof rack systems, which is great if you have it, but definitely check your owner's manual or consult your dealership or the manufacturer, because those factory roof racks may not actually be rated at the weight capacity that you need them to be. So the tent itself may be, say, 80 to 100 pounds, and then you have 2 occupants, which could be, 150 to 200 pounds each. So you're looking at, 400 or 500 pounds, and that's a static load. That's if you're not even moving. If you're crawling into it and bouncing and leveraging on the overhang, that's a dynamic load, and you're going to want a roof rack that is rated for much higher than that. Typically with roof racks, you would need 2 crossbars, 2 feet, the attachments that attach the actual feet to your vehicle, they'll be vehicle specific. So average price for a good roof rack, you can easily spend 1,000 to 1,500 Canadian, by the time you add up all the hardware. So something else to consider is a lack of versatility. As you can see behind me, the rooftop tent is affixed to the vehicle. There are some exceptions where people are attaching them to utility trailers, and that has a real benefit that will become clear in a second. But when it's attached to your vehicle, anytime you want to go anywhere, you need to pack it up. That is obviously an inconvenience, but in where I'm camping this weekend, these are first come, first served sites. Now, if that rooftop tent is affixed to a trailer, that can afford you some versatility. But there is another consideration where it's attached to your vehicle, is actually overhead clearance. So part of the reason why I have my tent mounted as low as I do is because I park underground, and I needed to be able to exit and enter without peeling off my tent. In fact, I really only had about 2 to 3 inches additional clearance above my roof to begin with, which is why I had these brackets fabricated as low as possible to begin with to afford me maximum clearance. Another benefit, of course, is mentioned in my Tonneau Plus rooftop tent rack video, is that this maintains my aerodynamics. But having it attached to the truck can and is an inconvenience sometimes. Another scenario where having the tent affixed to the vehicle is inconvenient is that you may be out doing other activities and not get to camp late. And that means that you are unable to come set up camp and then go do that activity. And so I personally experienced this when I went to Algonquin Park. I went up there to go do some canoeing, had a wonderful day on the water, packed up, got back to camp right in time for it to crack open and start raining. And so I had to set up that tent in the rain, which is uncomfortable to say the least. But you don't necessarily have that, immediate dry place to crawl into at the end of the day. So if we combine both points, a high cost and a lack of versatility, then the third and last point is cross-activity utilization. And what I mean by that is that this is a DCF ultra lightweight tent with carbon fiber poles. It's like the Ferrari of tents. This is a tarp tent, double rainbow Li, or a lithium. And this is a tent that I can use car camping. This is a tent that I can use backpacking. And this is a tent that I can use canoe camping. And I have done that in all three scenarios prior to having my rooftop tent. Making this large investment in a rooftop tent plus the rack system, I only get a rooftop tent. I cannot use it for canoeing. I cannot use it for backpacking. It is solely specifically for car camping. And so there are more opportunities with a freestanding tent if you only have a finite budget. This is something that I've accumulated over years, and I'm able to justify having two different styles of tenting experiences. So one advantage that you've probably heard before is the ease of setup. And in reality, it actually takes me about the same amount of time to set this up as it does this. The reason being is that this requires a little bit of finickiness with being able to secure your stakes. In this case, I've had to use some, creative solutions due to the hard ground. But the travel cover here, and there's the bungee cords on the inside to help pull in the tent. That does take a bit of time. You can get dirty pressing up against a vehicle if it's snowy or muddy or dusty. Now this one I have modified with the new clevis system so that my brow pole here is able to pop out and I can leave it in place. There will be a future video about that, but I'll include some teaser shots now. Nevertheless, the actual setup of the tent is only one part of the picture, whereas a backpacking style tent like this, just because it took about similar amount of time to set up the tent, doesn't mean that it's complete on the inside. So I would still need to inflate my sleeping mattress, or if it's maybe a self-inflating or a Z fold. I would still need to unpack my sleeping bag and my pillow and get everything all set up in there. Whereas a rooftop tent, the blankets and the mattress are already set up. I just simply need to unhook the bungee cords so I can access it, flip the blankets down into the foot area, and I use an inflatable pillow because I find that it helps a lot with moisture management. I used a foam pillow in the past, and it ends up absorbing a lot of water, and that's really uncomfortable because if you're camping in the mountains, as I do, that gets really cold overnight. So I use an inflatable pillow now. So if it's not already really obvious, one main advantage of a rooftop tent is size. This is a two-person model. This is a two-person tent. In fact, this is a wide two-person tent. This is 50 inches wide. A standard width for a two-person tent is 40. So imagine this 10 inches narrower. So, space. I have used this on road trips for nothing more than a change room at the beach, and it was awesome. You can sit up inside. You can't stand, but you could certainly kneel. You can do just about everything you need to. There's room for, two people and a dog down at the feet. I have my suitcase in here with, room to spare. Space. Space is a big, big, big advantage of rooftop tents, and this is the smallest of the three traditional sizes for rooftop tents. Another advantage of a rooftop tent is stealth camping. Now, I don't condone camping where you are not supposed to, but I have personally been on road trips attempting to get to a destination and unable to make it due to fatigue. And so this rooftop tent afforded me the opportunity to pull over in a safe public area and actually sleep for the night. Compared to a freestanding tent like this certainly looks like someone is camping here, and I would expect to see other, items around the campsite. This, though, is still attached to the vehicle, and it's much less visually impactful, and you would be, I think, less likely, provided that you're, abiding by the rules and regulations of the area, less likely to get questioned about what you're doing. This looks much less like you are camping. And this is coming from somebody who, again, I was on a road trip a number of years ago, and I wasn't able to get home, and so I ended up pulling over at a visitor center, bringing my vehicle to the edge of that visitor center and setting up my tent in such an area that other users of that area were less likely to see me. I'm sure everybody saw me. Despite the fact that this is quite high, I still think that it doesn't have the same aesthetic as camping. Another main advantage of rooftop tents is uneven ground and terrain. Now, we're camping in a really developed campsite here, but if you're pushing it into the backcountry a little bit more, you're more likely to find stumps and twigs and roots and uneven or unprepped surfaces. Now, granted, I have used a block here to help level out the tent because there is a down slope here that actually increases further down, but camping on uneven terrain, especially if you're in a mountain environment, where a lot of those campsites tend to be on a slope because there tends to be a mountain behind you, then this is much easier to find and create a level surface. I'm able to modify the ground here, or modify, I should say, the level of my sleeping surface by leveling out the vehicle. I'm unable to change the level of the ground behind me in a standard traditional freestanding tent. Something else to consider about a rooftop tent is if you're camping in a park system, they often have different ratings on the sites that say if it's suitable for tent only or motorhome or RV up to a certain length. The nice thing about a rooftop tent is that any of these sites will at least accommodate one vehicle, which means it can at least accommodate your tent. You can effectively camp anywhere in that sense. Whereas if you are camping and it's a RV only site, you can still set up a tent, but you may not be permitted to set up a freestanding tent. So camping anywhere without restriction of the site type or designation is certainly an advantage of rooftop tents. And last but not least, probably the number one advantage of a rooftop tent is just at-home living. I have sheets, I have a duvet, I'm free to move around. It feels much closer to sleeping at home than it does to sleeping in a tent. This is perhaps the biggest advantage of a rooftop tent, is that at-home comfort and feeling. So by now you're probably wondering, but Colin, what about getting up off the ground? Isn't that the number one advantage of rooftop tents? No. In fact, what I'd like to do is finish this video with a small segment called Dispelling Myths About Rooftop Tents. And the first myth is wildlife protection. Now, a brown bear can reach about 12 feet when standing on its hind legs. I am 5'9" or 175 centimeters, and I can certainly reach this. Now, fair credit if you've already said, but you have it mounted really low. Well, I can still get to you here, and a bear is twice as tall as I am. Wildlife protection is not an advantage of rooftop tents. It's a perceived advantage. Even creepy crawlies, maybe somewhat more resistant to snakes. We don't have a lot of snakes up here in Canada, so I'm not an expert. Maybe if someone's from Australia, they can chime in down below. I suspect a spider would have no problem crawling up this. Really most any other things that can get to you down on the ground can get to you up here. It's a perceived benefit. Now, maybe you have a loved one who refuses to tent on the ground like this, and they think that this is going to afford them those opportunities. Well, I think a lot of people just don't like the feeling of crawling into a tent. And admittingly, even with this tent, the doors are quite long, there is still like a ducking and sitting and spinning process involved versus climbing up a ladder. But I would attribute this more to space than I would necessarily being up or down. Similarly, climbing up here, my mom was trying to climb down and she scraped her leg up. I can't remember if she was bleeding, but I remember it hurt her quite a bit. So if you're not the most mobile, being up off the ground can actually present some real disadvantages as well. So off the ground trade-off. If you're putting a dog inside of the tent as well, especially if it's mounted on your roof and you're trying to load an 80-pound German Shepherd, I wouldn't want to be that guy doing it. Even 80 pounds onto shoulder height here would be difficult enough. So being off the ground, I think, is a myth in terms of like wildlife protection or just whatever perceived security that you think that that affords. So where does this leave us? Well, there are still lots of advantages of a traditional tent, most namely its versatility in use in different activities. There are definitely some advantages to rooftop tents, most specifically, in my opinion, the space that it affords. That said, if there is something that you feel is an advantage or a disadvantage or a myth, let me know in the comments down below. I'd actually really like to hear that, and I may make a follow-up video if there's enough suggestions that I haven't covered in this one. So as always, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this video. I sincerely do appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you guys in another one. You take care. Bye for now.